The fluorescent glow of the Grand Galleria Mall cast a sterile, almost clinical light over the bustling Saturday afternoon, a deceptive veneer of ordinary commerce that often masked the raw undercurrents of human interaction. For Marcus Thorne, navigating the labyrinthine corridors with his 6-year-old daughter Lily, clutching his hand, it was merely another weekend expedition into the consumer jungle, a necessary evil for new shoes and the promise of ice cream. But as they turned a corner into the children's apparel section of the sprawling department store, a sense of unease, faint yet persistent, pricked at the edges of his practiced calm. It was a familiar flicker, one that usually preceded a shift in atmospheric pressure, a change in the wind, the kind of subtle warning sign he'd learned to heed long ago in very different, far more volatile landscapes. He was a man built for resilience, but today, dressed in faded jeans, a well-worn flannel shirt and a pair of scuffed work boots, he was just another single dad, blending into the tapestry of the weekend crowd. Yet, beneath the unassuming exterior, behind eyes that held a surprising depth of both weariness and unwavering vigilance, lay a history that could shatter the comfortable complacency of those around him. A history forged in fire and shadow, a past that had carved etched lines of stoicism around his mouth and tempered his gaze into something infinitely more complex than simple parental affection. The people who were about to cross his path, however, saw only the visible surface, a slightly disheveled man with a distractible child, an easy target for their casual cruelty. They had no idea they were about to prod a sleeping dragon, to insult a man whose very presence had once commanded the respect and often the fear of hardened adversaries across the globe. The children's section, typically a vibrant cacophony of giggles and cartoon motifs, felt particularly oppressive. Lily, excited by a display of glitter-infused sneakers, tugged at Marcus's hand, her small voice a bright counterpoint to the piped-in elevator music. "Daddy, look. Sparkly ones," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with unadulterated joy. Marcus smiled, a genuine warmth briefly softening the stern lines of his face. "Hold on, sweet pea," he murmured, his gaze sweeping the immediate area, a habit ingrained from years of assessing potential threats, even in the most benign environments. It was an involuntary, automatic scan. Exits, potential choke points, suspicious movements. Here it registered only milling families and indifferent sales associates, but the habit persisted. It was then that the first spark of conflict ignited. Lily, in her enthusiastic scramble to reach a particular pair of iridescent high tops, inadvertently bumped into a meticulously arranged rack of tiny, expensive-looking dresses. The rack, designed more for aesthetic appeal than stability, wobbled precariously. Marcus instinctively reached out, but he was a fraction of a second too late. With a soft clatter, a cascade of miniature silk and lace garments slid from their hangers, tumbling onto the pristine tiled floor in a disarray of pastel hues. Before Marcus could even utter an apology or bend down to retrieve the fallen apparel, a sharp, dismissive voice cut through the air, piercing the gentle hum of the store. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Can't you control your child?" Marcus straightened slowly, turning towards the source. Two women, impeccably dressed in tailored suits and designer accessories, stood perhaps 10 feet away. One, slender with an imperious upturned nose and a severe blonde bob, looked down at the fallen clothes with an expression of utter disdain. This was Mrs. Sterling. Her companion, a woman with equally sharp features and a tight, condescending smile, Ms. Dubois, mirrored her disgust. They looked as if they had just stepped out of a high-fashion magazine, their presence radiating an aura of superiority that felt almost tangible. Their gaze, however, was fixed solely on Marcus, dissecting his unassuming attire, dismissing his very presence. "I apologize," Marcus said, his voice level, already bending to gather the dresses. Lily, her excitement instantly deflated, looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, her small hand flying to her mouth. The humiliation not just of the fallen clothes, but of the sharp public reprimand, was already setting in. Mrs. Sterling, however, was not finished. She took a deliberate step closer, her heels clicking crisply on the polished floor. "Apologies don't restock racks, do they? Honestly, some people just shouldn't be allowed in stores like this if they can't manage their offspring. Look at this mess." She gestured grandly with a manicured hand towards the scattered clothes, as if Lily had unleashed a natural disaster. Her tone was laced with an entitlement that grated, a thinly veiled contempt for anyone perceived to be outside her social strata. Marcus felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't anger, not yet, but a tactical assessment of the situation. An escalating threat. His initial impulse was to simply clean up and leave, to extricate Lily from the burgeoning discomfort. But the woman's words, the dismissive wave of her hand, felt like a deliberate provocation, an open declaration of social warfare. Why was he so calm, almost detached, in the face of such outright rudeness? Because he had faced down genuine existential threats, weapons pointed at his head, bombs ticking in the periphery. This was merely verbal sparring, an irritating mosquito buzzing around his ear. Yet, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes, hinted at a different kind of man beneath the surface, a man who had long ago learned to control his primal responses, but not to extinguish them entirely. It was an accident, Marcus stated, his voice a low rumble as he carefully folded a tiny denim skirt. He looked up, his gaze meeting Mrs. Sterling's, and for a fleeting instant, a flicker of something unreadable passed through her haughty expression. It wasn't fear, not yet, but perhaps a momentary recognition of an unexpected depth behind the tired eyes. A flash of something that didn't quite fit the picture she had so readily drawn of him. Ms. Dubois chimed in, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Oh, an accident. Of course. Children are such little tornadoes, aren't they? Especially when their parents aren't quite attentive. Her emphasis on attentive was pointed, clearly aimed at Marcus's perceived failing as a single parent. Lily, sensing the hostility, began to whimper, burying her face into Marcus's leg. His hand instinctively went to her hair, stroking it gently, a silent reassurance amidst the rising tension. A young sales assistant, fresh-faced and eager to please, now approached, drawn by the commotion. She looked from the impeccably dressed women to Marcus and Lily, then to the scattered clothes, her face a mask of mild panic. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her gaze lingering nervously on Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling immediately seized the opportunity. "Hardly, dear. This man's child has just devastated your display. Clearly they're not accustomed to handling delicate merchandise." She implied not just clumsiness, but a lack of class, a suggestion that Marcus and Lily simply didn't belong. The problem was escalating, drawing a small, curious audience from the periphery of the store. Whispers began to ripple through the racks, heads turned, and silent judgments were already being formed. Most eyes were on Marcus, judging his posture, his clothing, his perceived inability to control his child. Marcus, still methodically gathering the clothes, felt the subtle shift in the crowd's energy. It was a pattern he recognized. The formation of a hostile environment, the isolation of the target. His mind, trained for rapid threat assessment, began to process the data points. Number of aggressors, 2 active, 1 passive store employee, perhaps a dozen curious bystanders. Psychological tactics, shaming, public humiliation, appeal to authority, environmental factors, open space, minimal cover. It was absurd, of course, to apply such training to a mall incident, but the pathways in his brain were deeply etched. The real threat, he knew, was not physical, but to Lily's emotional well-being, to her sense of security and innocence. He had sworn to protect her from all harm, and this, in its insidious way, was harm. "There's no need for exaggeration," Marcus said, finally standing upright, a small stack of dresses neatly folded in his arms. He extended them towards the sales assistant. "They simply slipped. No damage, I assure you." His voice, though calm, held an underlying firmness that caused the sales assistant to hesitate for a moment before taking the clothes. Ms. Dubois let out a scoff. "No damage? Darling, the mere thought of a child like that touching these high-end items is damage enough." Her words were met with a few snickers from nearby shoppers who had paused to observe the drama unfold. The humiliation was no longer subtle. It was overt, public, and laced with a snobbery that was deeply offensive. This wasn't about the clothes. It was about status, about perceived class, about the right to look down upon someone. Lily, now openly weeping, buried her face further into Marcus's side, her small body trembling. It was the sound of her distress that struck Marcus harder than any insult. It was a sound he couldn't tolerate. His hand tightened around her small shoulder, a protective gesture that was as old as time. The calm exterior he maintained was a hard-won victory, a discipline forged in situations where losing control meant death. But watching his daughter crumble under the weight of these strangers' cruel words, a different kind of heat began to simmer beneath his calm. A cold, surgical rage, meticulously contained, yet undeniably present. He looked at Mrs. Sterling and Ms. Dubois, his gaze holding for a beat longer than was comfortable. "My daughter did nothing wrong," he stated, his voice still low, but now with an edge that was almost imperceptible to the casual ear, yet sharp enough to momentarily cut through the women's self-assured sneers. "It was an accident." "And you," he continued, sweeping his gaze between the two women, are making an absolute spectacle of yourselves by verbally attacking a child. Mrs. Sterling bristled. Spectacle? We are merely pointing out poor parenting and a lack of respect for property. Perhaps you should teach your daughter some manners, instead of letting her run wild through a luxury department store. She then turned to the sales assistant, her voice taking on a commanding tone. Are you going to let this man get away with this, or are you going to do something about it? This kind of clientele simply lowers the tone of the entire establishment. The sales assistant, caught between her demanding customers and the quietly intense father, looked utterly overwhelmed. She mumbled something about calling her manager. Marcus knew this was only going to prolong the agony for Lily. He just wanted to get her out, but now, leaving would feel like retreating in defeat, validating their cruelty. And something within him, a deep-seated code of honor and resilience, rebelled against that. He was not a man who retreated when his family was under attack, whether the weapons were words or bullets. He had learned the hard way that sometimes standing firm even when outnumbered was the only option. The mall, usually a sanctuary of escapism, had become a crucible. Marcus, holding his trembling daughter, faced down the escalating onslaught, his mind meticulously calculating, assessing. The humiliation was reaching its zenith for this particular interaction, but a deeper conflict, one that these snobbish women were woefully unprepared for, was just beginning to stir. They believed they had effectively shamed him, stripped him of his dignity in front of a small crowd. They believed they had won. They had no idea they had simply ignited a fuse, a very, very long fuse, on a powder keg they couldn't even comprehend. We will pay for any perceived damage, Marcus stated, his voice now devoid of any apology, replaced by a quiet authority that was chillingly out of place in the department store. Though I assure you there is none. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. It wasn't about the money, it was about ending the public spectacle for Lily, and about making a point. A point they were too myopic to grasp, but a point nonetheless. The humiliation stung, yes, but it was a fleeting sting. What lingered, what festered, was the insult to his daughter, and the utter arrogance of these strangers. The battle was far from over. The two women exchanged smug glances, a silent confirmation that they had successfully put this commoner in his place. They watched, satisfied, as Marcus produced his card, a silent sneer on Mrs. Sterling's face as if even the act of paying was beneath him. They saw a man who had succumbed to their pressure, a man defeated. But they were profoundly mistaken. What they saw as defeat, Marcus saw as tactical patience. He was merely repositioning, waiting. The game for him had only just begun. For those who witness such injustice, it often burns a quiet desire for retribution, for balance to be restored. And for Marcus, a man who had lived his life by the creed of justice, swift and decisive, this moment was merely the prologue. What would become of these two women, so quick to judge, so eager to humiliate, when they inevitably discovered the true nature of the man they had so carelessly scorned? What would happen when their carefully constructed world of superficiality collided with the raw, untamed power of a legend? Daniel stood there, a statue carved from a granite of suppressed fury, the echoes of the assistant manager's sneering words still hanging in the cavernous mall atrium. His hand instinctively found Lily's smaller one, gripping it with a gentle reassurance that belied the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. Lily, usually a vibrant splash of color in his life, was now a crumpled canvas of shame, her face buried against his leg, her tiny shoulders shaking with silent sobs that felt like earthquakes against his thigh. He could feel the raw, unfiltered pain radiating from her, a vibration that resonated with a long-dormant ache in his own chest, a scar tissue that had barely healed from past traumas he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Daniel's gaze, usually warm and filled with an almost naive wonder when with Lily, had hardened. It wasn't an aggressive stare, not yet, but a cool, analytical assessment that swept across the faces of the onlookers, lingering briefly on the smug smirk of the assistant manager, Brenda, and the indifferent shrug of the bulky security guard, Mitch. He processed the data, the shifting weight of the crowd, the hurried whispers, the uncomfortable avoidance in some eyes, the outright condemnation in others. For a man who had spent decades dissecting threats in environments far more hostile than a shopping mall, this situation, while superficially trivial, resonated with a familiar, insidious pattern. A localized power structure asserting dominance over the vulnerable. He remembered countless briefs in dimly lit rooms, the maps covered in red markers, the intel describing regimes that thrived on public degradation to control populations. This was a microversion, a suburban echo of that same ugly mechanism, and the raw injustice of it, directed at his daughter, twisted something deep within him, a knot of protectiveness and righteous anger that had been honed into a lethal instrument over years of service. Lily's small frame trembled against his side, a visceral tremor that shot through Daniel's arm and into his very core. He felt the rapid beat of her heart against his thigh, a fragile drumbeat of childhood innocence shattered by adult cruelty. The whispers intensified as they continued to stand there, an island of quiet distress amidst the mall's relentless hum of commerce, the cheerful muzak feeling like a cruel mockery. Brenda, emboldened by the perceived victory, stepped closer, her voice, now dripping with a faux sweet concern that was anything but, pierced the air again. "Look, sir, we appreciate your compliance. But perhaps this isn't the best environment for emotional displays. It's disruptive. And frankly, we have other customers to attend to." Her gaze flicked dismissively at Lily, as if the child's tears were an inconvenience, an unsightly stain on the polished mall floor that needed to be swiftly eradicated. Mitch, the security guard, shifted his weight, his eyes darting between Daniel and Brenda, a silent, almost imperceptible warning in his posture that he was ready to intervene if Daniel dared to make a scene. This was the overt threat, the power play, a tacit confirmation of Brenda's authority in this petty kingdom. Daniel's mind, usually a fortress of calm under pressure, felt a peculiar duality. One part of him, the dad, wanted to scoop Lily up, shield her from the prying eyes and vanish, to escape this suffocating bubble of public judgment. The other part, the dormant operative, analyzed the escape routes, the vulnerabilities, the psychological warfare at play. He had faced down armed insurgents with less palpable menace than the contained fury he now felt, a controlled burn threatening to erupt. The cold clarity that had once guided his hand on a trigger, that had allowed him to make life-or-death decisions in fractions of a second, was now directed at a mall assistant manager and a rent-a-cop. The absurdity of it was almost comical, yet the stakes for Lily felt immeasurably high. This wasn't about a toy or a spilled drink. It was about the sanctity of a child's dignity, a line Daniel had always considered sacrosanct. He remembered a time long ago in a dusty village square, seeing an older man being publicly shamed for a trivial offense, the fear in the villager's eyes, the quiet rage in his own. The parallels, however faint, were unsettling, a subtle but persistent reminder that human nature, in its capacity for cruelty, often remained unchanged regardless of the backdrop. Brenda, mistaking Daniel's silence for submission, preened slightly. She saw a disheveled single father, clearly out of his element, struggling with an overly emotional child. A common enough sight. She dealt with problem customers daily, and her efficiency in handling them was a point of pride, something she regularly highlighted in her performance reviews. Her managerial aspirations were tethered to maintaining a pristine, orderly shopping environment, and this man and his crying child were a blatant disruption. She imagined the perfectly worded email she'd send to her regional manager, detailing her decisive action in de-escalating a potentially volatile situation, all while preserving the brand image. She didn't see the controlled tremor in Daniel's hand, the almost imperceptible tensing of his jawline, or the way his eyes, though downcast, missed absolutely nothing. She saw weakness, and she exploited it with the precision of a predator sensing an easy meal, convinced of her own righteousness and the unassailability of her position. Just as Brenda was about to deliver another cutting remark, a new figure appeared at the periphery. A sales associate from a nearby boutique, a young woman named Clara, had been observing the scene with growing unease. She recognized Daniel and Lily. They were regulars, if infrequent, and always polite. Lily often waved at her, and Daniel always offered a courteous nod, sometimes even a weary but genuine smile. Clara had seen Daniel handle Lily's occasional meltdowns with a quiet patience that put most parents to shame. This public shaming felt fundamentally wrong, a gross overreach of authority, a bullying tactic dressed in corporate policy. Her heart clenched as she saw Lily's tears, and a simmering indignation began to boil within her. She was just a sales associate, barely paid enough to cover rent, easily replaceable, but something about the cold, unfeeling righteousness radiating from Brenda spurred her to action. She took a hesitant step forward, an almost imperceptible movement, but enough to register on Daniel's hyper-aware periphery. He hadn't seen her, not really, but his senses, honed by years of threat assessment, registered a shift in the ambient energy, a new variable in the tense equation. Brenda, still focused on Daniel, didn't notice Clara. "Now if you'll excuse us," she said, her voice laced with finality, gesturing vaguely towards the exit. It was a dismissal, a command to disappear, to remove their unsightly presence from her perfectly curated commercial ecosystem. Daniel finally lifted his head, his eyes, still shaded by a profound sadness for Lily, met Brenda's. There was no aggression, no overt challenge, only a deep, unsettling stillness that made Brenda momentarily falter. It was the gaze of a man who had seen too much, understood too much, and was now weighing options with an almost terrifying impartiality. Lily, sensing the shift, looked up, her tear-streaked face momentarily frozen in apprehension, clinging to his leg as if he were her only anchor in a suddenly hostile world. The weight of all eyes on them was crushing, a palpable pressure that settled on Daniel's shoulders, a burden he had carried in far more perilous circumstances. But then those other circumstances had clear objectives, identifiable enemies, and tools to meet them. Here he was just a dad, cornered, his only weapon a quiet dignity that was rapidly being stripped away by the mundane cruelty of the ordinary. He thought of the times he'd had to keep a poker face while an enemy interrogator tried to break him, searching for any flicker of fear, any crack in the facade. This felt eerily similar, though the stakes were profoundly different. There it was his life, his mission, his comrades. Here it was his daughter's spirit, her tender heart, her perception of the world. And that, he realized with a chilling clarity, was a far higher stake. He remembered the unyielding principles hammered into him during selection: composure under duress, protecting the innocent, standing firm against tyranny no matter the scale. This wasn't a battlefield, but the echoes of those lessons reverberated through him with an unexpected force. He had learned to read people, to understand the subtle shifts in body language that tells. He saw the gleam in Brenda's eyes, not of authority but of petty triumph, a small-minded gratification. He saw the insecurity masked by Mitch's bulk, the way the man avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to defy his superior. And he saw, most disturbingly, the quiet acceptance in the eyes of many bystanders, the silent capitulation to a small, arbitrary power. This was how it started always. Small injustices, unchecked, leading to larger ones, gradually eroding the fabric of decency and empathy. Brenda, regaining her composure, pressed on, her voice now a low, venomous hiss, barely audible above the mall's ambient noise but sharp enough to pierce Daniel's ears. Perhaps next time, you could ensure your daughter is better equipped to handle a public outing. Or perhaps consider leaving her with a sitter if she's prone to these kinds of outbursts. We aim for a certain ambience here, and frankly, her crying is quite disruptive to our other patrons' shopping experience. Her words were a calculated cruelty, designed to cut Daniel where it hurt most, his capacity as a father, his very identity as a protector. This wasn't just about a rule anymore, it was a personal attack on his parenting, an assertion that he was somehow unfit, inadequate. The air in the mall seemed to thicken, the ambient noise of music and chatter fading into a background drone as a pocket of silence formed around them, drawing all attention to the unfolding drama. Lily's whimpers grew louder, a desperate, broken sound that squeezed Daniel's heart. Daniel's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible clench that only someone intimately familiar with stress signals would notice. His hands, which had so often held delicate instruments of war with precise control, now felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated protectiveness. He wanted to lash out, to silence Brenda's cruel words, to sweep away the injustice with a single decisive action, but he knew instinctively that any overt show of anger would only validate her narrative of him as an unstable, disruptive force. He had to be smarter, calmer, more strategic. He had to think like he did when planning an extraction, considering every variable, every potential outcome, every possible countermove. His gaze swept over the crowd again, searching for an ally, an opening, anything. He saw the fleeting look of pity in an elderly woman's eyes, the quick, averted gaze of a young couple. No one was stepping in. No one ever did, not truly. He was on his own, just as he had been countless times before. But this time it wasn't just his life on the line, it was Lily's fragile sense of security, her burgeoning understanding of the world. Clara, the sales associate, felt a surge of adrenaline, a hot flush spreading across her cheeks. She knew her job could be on the line if she interfered, she could be reprimanded, even fired, but the image of Lily's tear-streaked face was a powerful motivator. She had seen too many petty tyrants like Brenda wield their minimal power to inflict maximum pain, to belittle and diminish others for their own fleeting sense of control. She took another, more deliberate step forward, her voice, though soft, carrying a surprising steel that belied her youthful appearance. "Excuse me, Brenda, but I think that's a bit harsh, don't you? Lily is a sweet child, and Mr. Davis is always very polite. The words, though simple, sliced through the tense silence, a tiny rebellion against the established order, a crack in the carefully maintained facade of authority. Brenda spun around, her face contorting into a mask of furious indignation. "Clara, what do you think you're doing? This is none of your concern. Get back to your register now." Her voice rose in pitch, betraying her sudden loss of control, her carefully constructed composure shattering under the unexpected challenge. This was an affront to her authority, a public challenge, and she would not tolerate it. Mitch, the security guard, finally took a more assertive step forward, his hand subtly moving towards the radio clip to his belt, his eyes now fixed on Clara as well, a silent warning for her to retreat. The situation was visibly escalating, no longer a one-sided humiliation but a nascent, multifaceted conflict, drawing more and more curious stares. Daniel, ever the observer, registered the shift. Clara was a new, unexpected variable. An unknown element. Was she an ally, or simply another distraction, another potential victim? He had learned to trust very few people in his life, and spontaneous acts of bravery in public were rare, almost mythical. Yet her voice, though hesitant, carried a genuine note of compassion, an unmistakable purity of intention. He mentally re-evaluated the situation, recalculating probabilities, assessing new threat vectors. The dynamic had changed, however, slightly. It provided a momentary reprieve from Brenda's relentless assault, but also introduced a new layer of complexity. Now, Clara was also a target, and Daniel's instinct to protect extended beyond his immediate family. It was ingrained, an unbreakable code that didn't distinguish between friend or stranger when injustice was being meted out. Lily, startled by the sudden confrontation between Brenda and Clara, let out a fresh sob, clinging to Daniel tighter. Her small body shook with renewed intensity, her cries echoing in the brief lull that followed Brenda's outburst. The noise was raw, heartbreaking, and seemed to amplify the shame Daniel felt, not for himself but for her, for the world that could inflict such pain on an innocent. He wished he could make it all disappear, make them all vanish, Brenda disappear, the judging eyes evaporate into thin air. He wished he could transport them instantly to the quiet sanctuary of their small apartment, where Lily felt safe and cherished, where the only sounds were her laughter and the quiet turning of storybook pages. But here, in this sterile, brightly lit arena, he felt utterly exposed, his extraordinary past irrelevant, his training useless against the mundane cruelty of a mall manager. His mind drifted, almost involuntarily, to a desolate outpost in the desert, the wind whipping sand against his face, the stark clarity of a mission objective. There, the enemy was defined, the rules of engagement understood, however brutal. Here the enemy wore a name tag and wielded a walkie-talkie, and the rules were a vague, oppressive social contract that could be twisted and weaponized by anyone with a modicum of authority. He remembered the feeling of a rifle in his hands, the weight of responsibility, the surge of adrenaline before a breach, the absolute certainty of his purpose. Now his hands were empty, save for the small, trembling hand of his daughter, and the only battle was for her dignity, her right to exist without being judged and shamed. He took a deep, slow breath, a technique honed to steady nerves before a critical moment, a vital function of self-preservation. It was a muscle memory, a reflex. He closed his eyes for a split second, an almost imperceptible blink, and when they opened, a flicker of something ancient, something dangerous, passed through them. It wasn't overt, not a threat, but a quiet resolve that suggested a profound well of untapped strength, a reservoir of discipline forged in crucibles far hotter than this mall atrium. The crowd, initially transfixed by the public humiliation, now seemed to divide. Some still stared with detached curiosity, others averted their gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension, perhaps even ashamed of their own inaction. A few, however, notably the elderly woman who had shown pity earlier, watched Clara with a glimmer of hope, a silent cheer for someone finally pushing back, a small spark of human kindness igniting in the sterile environment. The atmosphere was no longer just one of shame and discomfort. It was now charged with a nascent sense of injustice, a collective breath held in anticipation of what might happen next. No one was leaving. Everyone was waiting. The mall's carefully constructed illusion of serene consumerism had been shattered, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable human drama unfolding in real time. Daniel's gaze, now sharp and focused, locked onto Clara, then Brenda, then Mitch, then the wider crowd, a rapid scan of the evolving battlefield. He had to choose his next move carefully. Any misstep here, and Lily's experience would be etched deeper, more painfully, a wound that might never truly heal. But something else was stirring within him, something beyond just protecting Lily. It was the principle. The ingrained, unbreakable code that demanded he stand against injustice, no matter how small, no matter the personal cost, no matter how absurd the setting. The choice was no longer just about de-escalation, it was about standing his ground. And for a man who had dedicated his life to standing his ground in the most impossible of places, this sterile mall suddenly felt like the next frontier, a proving ground for principles he had thought were reserved for wars and far-off conflicts. The air thrummed with unspoken words, with the weight of choices yet to be made, and the quiet, almost imperceptible shift in Daniel's demeanor promised that the resolution, whatever it might be, would be anything but ordinary. The silence was pregnant with anticipation, broken only by Lily's ragged breathing and the faint, distant strains of elevator music. The oppressive hum of the fluorescent lights in the mall security office seemed to amplify the suffocating tension, each flicker an accusation. Alex, his hand a steady anchor for Lily's small, trembling fingers, felt the weight of every gaze, every hushed judgment, pressing down upon them like a physical force. The initial shock had given way to a cold, analytical calm that settled deep within him, a familiar, almost instinctual response to high-stress environments, a paradox of peace amidst chaos that had seen him through more than one impossible situation. Yet, this situation, domestic and absurd as it was, threatened to unravel him in ways no battlefield ever had. Officer Davies, a man whose uniform seemed 2 sizes too small, stretching tautly across his midsection, leaned back in his swivel chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. His eyes, small and dark, darted from Alex's composed face to Lily's tear-streaked one, lingering there with a predatory curiosity that made Alex's jaw clench. Beside him, Ms. Albright, the store manager from Chic Tots, clutched a clipboard to her chest like a shield, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. She had a certain kind of brittle elegance, the kind that shattered at the slightest inconvenience, and Alex was rapidly becoming her biggest inconvenience of the day. "So, Mr. Thorne," Davies began, his voice dripping with an unearned authority that grated on Alex's nerves. "Let's go over this again. Ms. Albright here clearly states you were creating a disturbance, attempting to return merchandise without a receipt, and then, when politely refused, became belligerent. Furthermore, we have multiple eyewitness accounts of you raising your voice, and even threatening staff." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, thick with implied guilt. "And now, to add insult to injury, we find the item, a rather expensive designer doll, I might add, in your daughter's backpack." The accusation, cold and bald, was a punch to the gut. Lily whimpered, burying her face further into Alex's side. He squeezed her hand reassuringly, his thumb tracing soothing patterns on her skin, but his eyes never left Davies. "That's a lie," Alex stated, his voice low, steady, devoid of the anger he felt churning beneath the surface. His training had taught him the power of a calm voice in a storm, how it could disarm or infuriate. Davies, it seemed, was the latter. "I tried to explain. Lily found the doll earlier, she picked it up, and before I could even find the right aisle to put it back or approach a sales associate, Ms. Albright here descended upon us, accusing me of shoplifting." Ms. Albright scoffed, a brittle, dismissive sound. "He's twisting it, officer." He was already looking suspicious, lingering in the children's section, not buying anything. And then he tries to return an item he clearly never purchased without a receipt. It's an open and shut case of attempted theft and disorderly conduct. I've dealt with his kind before. Her words were like venom, laced with an implicit judgment of Alex's character, his status as a single father, his very presence. His kind. The phrase echoed in Alex's mind, a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor running through him. He recognized the insidious nature of such dismissals, the way they stripped a person of their dignity, rendering them invisible, or worse, a caricature of their worst assumptions. Alex's gaze swept over the small, sterile room. He noted the single camera mounted in the corner, its red light blinking silently. He assessed the heavy, bolted-down table between them, the 2 exits, one leading to the public corridor, the other, presumably, to an employee-only area. He catalogued Davies's nervous fidgeting with his pen, the way Ms. Albright constantly adjusted her glasses. Small tells, minor stress indicators, but in Alex's world, no detail was insignificant. He was processing data, not just listening to accusations, and what he was seeing was less about justice and more about maintaining appearances, about corporate policy, about a man and a woman who had already decided their narrative. "And what about these multiple eyewitness accounts?" Alex challenged, his voice still even, almost impossibly so, given the inferno raging within. He was acutely aware of Lily, her small body pressed against his, absorbing every hostile word, every cold glance. This was the true humiliation, not the accusations themselves, but the public degradation of her father, the man she looked up to as her hero. He needed to protect her from this ugliness, shield her innocent world from the cynicism and cruelty of adults. Davies tapped his pen against a stack of papers. "We have statements. From a sales associate, from a customer who observed your behavior." He pushed a form across the table, not for Alex to read but for effect. "Look, Mr. Thorne, this isn't going to go away. We've already received calls from other shoppers expressing concern. People are filming this, you know." He gestured vaguely with his chin, implying the wider mall. "It's all over social media. A man causing a scene, terrorizing staff with a child in tow." The thinly veiled accusation of bad parenting, of endangering his own daughter, was a calculated blow, and Alex felt a sharp, guttural instinct to lash out, to silence this pompous fool. But he suppressed it, a lifetime of training asserting itself. He took a slow, deep breath, the air tasting stale and metallic. He had been in situations where the air was thick with gunpowder and fear, where the stakes were life and death, and he had maintained his composure. This was different. This was his daughter. The threat here was not to his life, but to his reputation, his bond with Lily, her fragile sense of security. Lily, feeling the unspoken shift in the room, looked up at Alex, her eyes wide and trusting. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why are they being mean? You didn't do anything wrong." That innocent question, so pure and unadulterated, ripped through Alex's carefully constructed emotional barriers. He managed a faint smile for her, a monumental effort of will. "It's okay, sweet pea," he murmured, pulling her closer. "Daddy's just trying to sort things out. It's a misunderstanding." He hated the lie, hated having to sugarcoat the hostility they were facing, but he couldn't burden her with the ugly realities of adult malice. "Not yet." His gaze flickered back to Davies and Albright. He saw the way Albright's lips curled almost imperceptibly at Lily's words, as if the child's distress was further proof of Alex's unsuitability as a father. It was a sneer, barely there, but Alex saw it. He always saw it. The micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in posture, the cadence of speech, these were the tools he used to gauge intent, to predict threats, to survive. And what he saw now was a petty cruelty that was almost more insidious than outright hostility. "Mr. Thorne, your daughter is clearly distressed," Albright chimed in, her voice falsely sweet, a saccharine tone that was more condescending than comforting. "Perhaps it's time you taught her the difference between right and wrong. Or perhaps, for her sake, you should just admit your mistake, apologize, and we can all move on." She was offering a way out, a humiliating capitulation, designed to break him. Alex's eyes, usually a calm hazel, seemed to darken, a flash of an intensity that was almost frightening in its stillness. For a fleeting second, the veteran operator surfaced, the man who had faced down armed hostiles in hostile lands. He could dismantle these people verbally, psychologically, with surgical precision. He could expose their flimsy accusations, their procedural errors, their inherent biases. But the cost would be a display of aggression, of an alpha male dominance that would terrify Lily and only confirm their worst suspicions. He was trapped in a no-win scenario, forced to fight with one hand tied behind his back, for the sake of his daughter's peace. He saw the recording phone of a young man peering in from the doorway, his face obscured by the bright screen. The digital age had turned public humiliation into a spectator sport, amplifying the shame, making it inescapable. He felt the phantom pressure of a camera lens, a familiar sensation from past missions where every move was scrutinized, every action analyzed. But then the cameras had been friendly, his actions justified, his reputation protected. Here he was being judged by a kangaroo court, recorded for posterity, his character assassinated by anonymous online commentators. "I will not admit to something I didn't do," Alex said, his voice firm now, the underlying steel in his tone beginning to show through. He was not belligerent, not aggressive, but unwavering. This was a line he would not cross. He would not sacrifice his integrity, not in front of his daughter. "And I certainly won't teach my daughter that standing up for the truth is wrong, simply to move on from your false accusations." Davies sighed dramatically, running a hand over his thinning hair. "All right, Mr. Thorne. Have it your way. Since you're being uncooperative, I'm going to have to call the local precinct. We can have a uniformed officer come down, take statements, and proceed with a formal complaint. This will mean a police record, Mr. Thorne. Not just for attempted theft, but for disorderly conduct and potentially, if the judge sees fit, for endangering a minor. Is that what you want?" His tone was condescending, a thinly veiled threat, designed to evoke fear and submission. Lily gasped, her small hand clutching Alex's shirt. "Police? Daddy, no. I don't want you to get in trouble." Her voice was a small, pained cry, tearing at Alex's heart. He felt a surge of incandescent rage, a primal scream of frustration threatening to erupt. These people, in their petty arrogance, were terrifying his child. The carefully constructed facade of the calm, understanding father was cracking under the immense strain. He could feel the familiar tightening in his shoulders, the subtle shift in his breathing, the cold, calculated focus that usually preceded decisive action. He was moments away from shedding the civilian mask, from letting the true him surface. He forced himself to meet Davies's gaze, his eyes like flint. "You're trying to intimidate me," Alex stated, not a question but a factual observation, delivered with an unnerving calm. "And you're doing it in front of my daughter. You know full well that bringing the police into this is an escalation that will only cause more distress to a child who is already frightened." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching for a flicker of humanity, a hint of conscience. There was none. Just the smug satisfaction of a man holding power. Ms. Albright stepped forward, her voice rising in pitch. "Oh, now he's trying to turn this around, officer. He's attempting to manipulate the situation, make us out to be the villains. This is exactly the kind of behavior I reported. He's evasive, he's aggressive, he's clearly guilty." She pointed a trembling finger at Alex, her eyes wide with what seemed like genuine fear, or a very convincing performance of it. Alex watched her, a cynical part of his mind appreciating the theatricality. She was playing to the camera, playing to Davies, painting him as the aggressor. He knew this tactic. He'd seen it in interrogations, in psychological warfare. Distort the truth, amplify perceived threats, isolate the target. He was their target, and they were experts in their small, mal-enforced dominion. But even as his analytical mind dissected their tactics, his father's heart ached for Lily. Her small body was shaking, her eyes darting between the angry adults and her father, seeking reassurance that wasn't fully there. He saw her innocence fraying at the edges, saw the confusion and fear etching themselves onto her young face. This was worse than any physical wound. This was a wound to her sense of safety, her trust in the world. He felt the familiar urge to scan the room for escape routes, for weaknesses in their defenses, not just physical but logical, legal. He considered the camera, the public outcry, the potential for this to spiral out of control. His military mind, honed to react to kinetic threats, found this form of psychological assault both frustrating and strangely compelling. It was a different kind of battlefield, one where his usual tools were not only ineffective but counterproductive. "Officer Davies," Alex began again, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying an undeniable resonance that cut through the room's tension. "Let's be clear. I have done nothing wrong. My daughter picked up a doll. I was returning it. This entire situation is a manufactured crisis. I want to leave with my daughter. Now." His eyes, direct and unblinking, bored into Davies, a silent challenge in their depths. It was the gaze of a man who was used to giving orders, not taking them, a gaze that had unnerved, hardened adversaries. Davies, for a split second, faltered. He met Alex's stare, and something in those calm, unwavering hazel eyes gave him pause. A flicker of uncertainty, a ripple beneath his smug facade. But then Ms. Albright, sensing the wavering, stepped in. "Don't let him intimidate you, officer," she hissed. "He's trying to manipulate you. He just wants to get away before the police arrive. This is exactly what a guilty person would do." Her words reinflated Davies's ego. He straightened, clearing his throat, his dark eyes hardening once more. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Thorne. Not until we've fully investigated. And considering your lack of cooperation, and the item found in your daughter's bag." He let the implication hang heavy and damning. "We have probable cause to detain you. If you resist, I'll have no choice but to use force." The word force hung in the air, a threat, a challenge. Alex felt a primal tremor run through him, a jolt of pure, adrenaline-fueled readiness. Force was a language he understood intimately. He'd faced it, inflicted it, survived it. The thought of this man, this petty mall cop, laying a hand on him, let alone threatening him in front of Lily, ignited a spark of something dangerous deep within him. His gaze dropped to Davies's belt, noting the standard-issue equipment: handcuffs, taser, pepper spray. He assessed the man's posture, his weight distribution, his lack of situational awareness beyond his immediate focus on Alex. He saw the weak points, the openings, the predictable responses. It was an involuntary scan, a habit ingrained through years of high-stakes environments, a reflex that fired even in this ludicrous situation. He could disarm Davies in a heartbeat, secure the room, control the narrative. But the image of Lily's terrified face flashed in his mind, extinguishing the violent impulse. This was not the time. Not here. Not like this. He had to remain calm for her. He had to absorb every insult, every humiliation, every injustice, and turn it into something she wouldn't have to carry. That was his mission now. Not to fight but to protect. Not to win but to endure. He tightened his grip on Lily's hand, a silent promise. The fight was far from over, but the battlefield had shifted. And Alex Thorne, the single dad, was about to teach these people a lesson they never saw coming, though they didn't yet realize they were facing a legend. "You're making a mistake, officer," Alex said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, a low, ominous rumble that sent a shiver down Davies' spine despite himself. A very grave mistake. It was not a threat, but a statement of undeniable, impending fact. The air in the small office crackled with an unspoken tension, a calm before a storm that only one person in the room was truly prepared for. Lily, sensing the shift, looked up at her father again, her innocent eyes reflecting the terrifying, unblinking resolve she saw there. Her world might be crumbling, but her daddy's eyes promised that everything, somehow, would eventually be all right. Or at least they promised that he wouldn't let it completely fall apart. The question was, at what cost? And when would his true nature finally be unleashed? The shrill, piercing wail that tore through the sterile air of the mall security office was not Lily's. It was the sound of Michael's heart being ripped from his chest, disguised as the agonized cry of his daughter. Each sob was a dagger, twisting deeper with every dismissive gesture from Officer Davies, every self-satisfied smirk from Mr. Harrison, and every vacant stare from the mall's head of security, a man whose name Michael hadn't even bothered to register. So inconsequential did he seem in the grand scheme of things Michael usually contended with. Lily, clutching the worn plush bear that had been her constant companion since her mother's passing, was now openly weeping, her small body trembling uncontrollably, her face a blotchy crimson mess, streaked with tears and snot. "Daddy, I'm scared," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper against the cacophony of accusations. This was it. The absolute nadir. Michael, a man who had faced down armed hostiles in arid deserts and dense jungles, who had navigated labyrinthine tunnels beneath enemy strongholds, found himself utterly disarmed by the sight of his daughter's terror. His fists, accustomed to gripping the cold steel of a rifle, yearned to clench, to strike, to protect. Yet he stood motionless, his hands deliberately open, palms facing outward in a gesture of non-aggression that felt utterly alien to his very being. He was trapped, not by physical restraints, but by an insidious web of bureaucracy, ignorance, and the pervasive, suffocating judgment of those who saw only what they wanted to see. The humiliation was a thick, cloying substance, coating his throat, burning his eyes, threatening to breach the impenetrable fortress of calm he had meticulously constructed over decades of high-stakes operations. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remain silent." Officer Davies' voice cut through the air, sharp and unyielding, laced with an authority that felt entirely misplaced in this context. He looked at Michael with an almost clinical detachment, a professional disdain. "Your daughter's distress is noted, but it doesn't change the facts. We have multiple witness statements, security footage, and the direct testimony of Mr. Harrison here, concerning the disturbance you caused and the potential threat you posed to other shoppers." The word, potential, hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations of violence and instability. Mr. Harrison, his suit jacket now slightly askew from his earlier theatrical performance of concern, nodded vigorously, his eyes gleaming with a malicious satisfaction. He had engineered this. Michael could see it in the man's smug expression, the way his lips twitched just perceptibly at the corners. This wasn't just about a stolen toy or a perceived altercation. This was about power, about a man in a cheap suit asserting dominance over someone he deemed beneath him. Lily's cries escalated, a desperate, raw sound that made the cheap fluorescent lights of the office hum with an almost palpable tension. "She's scared because of you people." Michael finally erupted, his voice a low growl, utterly devoid of the calm he had been striving for. His composure, usually as unyielding as granite, was cracking under the immense pressure of his daughter's suffering. "You have cornered an innocent man, harassed my child, and accused us of theft based on nothing but your manager's twisted narrative and an absolute misunderstanding." He stepped forward, a single deliberate pace, and the two mall security guards who had been lounging by the door, instinctively stiffened, their hands drifting towards their hips, where their tasers lay dormant. Officer Davies, too, took a step back, his hand subtly moving towards his service weapon. "One more outburst, Mr. Miller, and you will be facing charges for resisting arrest and obstruction," Davies warned, his voice hardening, his eyes narrowed. "And given the circumstances, the state of your daughter, and the allegations, I might have to consider calling Child Protective Services. We cannot have a child in an environment where her guardian is exhibiting aggressive tendencies." The threat, cold and calculated, struck Michael harder than any physical blow. Child Protective Services. The possibility of losing Lily, of having her taken from him even temporarily, was a terror far greater than any enemy he had ever encountered. It was the ultimate weapon against a father, and Davies had wielded it with surgical precision. Lily's whimpers subsided into ragged gasps, as if she too understood the gravity of the implied threat. She buried her face in Michael's leg, her small hands clutching his jeans, her entire being radiating fear. Aggressive tendencies? Michael scoffed, a dark, humorless sound that rumbled from deep within his chest. "I have done nothing but try to de-escalate this absurd situation from the moment it began. Your manager," he glared at Harrison, who visibly flinched, "instigated this entire charade because he felt disrespected. This isn't about shoplifting, it's about his ego, and now you're threatening to tear my family apart based on his pathetic whim." Just as Officer Davies was about to deliver another cutting retort, a high-pitched, insistent chirping emanated from his hip. It was his police radio demanding attention. He scowled, clearly annoyed by the interruption, but dutifully unclipped it. "Davies here," he barked into the receiver, his back turned slightly to Michael, his posture still radiating authority. As he listened, his expression began to change, subtly at first. His brows furrowed. His lips thinned. The condescending smirk that had been a permanent fixture on his face slowly melted away, replaced by a growing perplexity, then, unmistakably, by a dawning apprehension. He shifted his weight, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as the voice on the other end of the line continued its urgent monologue. The other police officer in the room, a younger, less experienced man named Officer Jenkins, noticed his partner's sudden shift and leaned in, a question forming on his lips. Davies didn't answer Jenkins. Instead, he pulled the radio away from his ear, his gaze sweeping over the room, settling on Michael, then on Harrison, then back to Michael, a look of profound confusion now etching itself onto his features. The self-assuredness that had defined him moments ago had vanished, replaced by an unsettling uncertainty. The air in the room, thick with accusation, suddenly crackled with a different kind of electricity. It was the electricity of impending change, of a shift in momentum that Michael, with his trained instincts, sensed immediately. Before Davies could utter a word, the door to the security office burst open with a resounding thud. Standing in the doorway was a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room with an almost predatory efficiency. She exuded an aura of authority that made Mr. Harrison's petty self-importance seem utterly ludicrous. Behind her, a burly, stoic man with a discreet earpiece stood guard, his gaze unwavering, his hand resting casually on his lapel, betraying the concealed weapon beneath. The woman didn't wait for an invitation. She strode purposefully into the room, her high heels clicking crisply on the linoleum floor. Her gaze fell upon Michael, taking in his disheveled appearance, Lily's tear-streaked face, and the remnants of the half-eaten hot dog. Then, her eyes flickered to Davies, then to Harrison, a barely perceptible tremor of contempt passing over her features. "Officer Davies, I presume?" she asked, her voice calm but resonant, carrying an undeniable weight of command. Davies, caught off guard, stammered, "Yes, ma'am." Who are you?" She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she produced a black leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal an official badge and identification card. "Special Agent Thorne, FBI," she stated, her voice devoid of any warmth, her eyes like chips of ice. "And I believe you have a Major Michael Miller in your custody." The words hung in the air, heavy, significant. Davies' jaw went slack. Jenkins, the younger officer, visibly paled. Mr. Harrison, initially perplexed, now looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Major Michael Miller. The name, spoken with such gravity by an FBI agent, resonated differently than the mere Mr. Miller he had so carelessly dismissed. Agent Thorne's gaze, now fixed solely on Davies, was unwavering. "My office received a rather urgent call from a concerned party. They indicated that Major Miller, a highly decorated active-duty Special Forces operator currently on medical leave, was being unlawfully detained and his child harassed over a trivial matter." Is this true, Officer Davies? Her tone was not a question but a stark demand for confirmation. Davies, struggling to regain his composure, stammered, "Ma'am, he was involved in an altercation. Allegations of shoplifting, creating a disturbance. The mall manager here, Mr. Harrison, claims he was threatening." He gestured feebly towards Harrison, who now looked as though he wished the floor would swallow him whole. Agent Thorne didn't even glance at Harrison. Her focus remained entirely on Davies, her intensity unnerving. "Allegations from whom, officer?" "A mall manager whose credibility, from what I understand, is currently under internal review by his corporate office for multiple complaints of harassment and racial profiling?" "And how exactly was Major Miller threatening?" "By attempting to calm his terrified daughter while being unjustly accused by your department and this establishment." Her words were precise, each one landing like a hammer blow. Michael, holding Lily tighter, felt a profound wave of something akin to relief wash over him. Not for himself but for Lily. The threat of CPS, the insidious humiliation, was now being systematically dismantled. Agent Thorne then turned her attention to Michael. Her expression softened, just slightly, a flicker of respect in her steely eyes. "Major Miller, are you and your daughter all right?" Michael nodded, his voice still hoarse. "We will be, Agent Thorne. Thank you." Thorne then pivoted, her eyes sweeping over the mall security guards, who now looked like petrified garden gnomes, and finally resting on Mr. Harrison, whose face had gone from smug to an unhealthy shade of gray. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice dripping with an icy contempt that made the man visibly tremble. "I am Special Agent Thorne. And I have it on extremely good authority that you have not only filed a false report, but have actively participated in the unlawful detention and harassment of a decorated U.S. military officer and his child. Do you have any idea of the federal ramifications of your actions?" Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But he was just a dad. He looked ordinary, he blurted out, a desperate, pathetic defense that only solidified his ignorance and prejudice. Agent Thorne's lips curled into a disdainful sneer. "Ordinary, Mr. Harrison? Major Michael Miller is anything but ordinary. He served 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan with Delta Force. He led highly classified operations, extracted hostages from impossible situations, and was decorated for valor multiple times, including a Silver Star for actions that saved the lives of an entire SEAL team. He operates in the shadows, Mr. Harrison, protecting people like you from threats you can't even begin to comprehend. And he's currently on medical leave, suffering from wounds sustained while protecting this country, trying to live a quiet life with his daughter." Her voice rose, each word a hammer blow against Harrison's rapidly crumbling facade of authority. "You, Mr. Harrison, in your pathetic little kingdom of retail, decided to humiliate this man, to accuse him of theft, and to threaten his child, because he didn't fit your narrow, prejudiced view of what a customer should be." The words hung in the air, a devastating indictment. Davies and Jenkins stood frozen, their faces pale with shock and dawning horror. The mall security guards looked utterly bewildered, their petty power games exposed as laughably trivial in the face of true authority. "And you, Officer Davies," Thorne continued, her gaze snapping back to the local police officer. "You blindly followed the narrative of a man with a documented history of malicious behavior, neglected to conduct a proper investigation, and threatened to involve Child Protective Services against a grieving father who was simply trying to navigate a difficult situation with his child. Do you understand the implications of falsely accusing a decorated Special Forces operative of instability?" Davies, his face crimson with shame and fear, stammered, "Ma'am, I didn't know. He didn't identify himself. He just said his name was Michael Miller. And it is your job to assess the situation, officer, not to jump to conclusions based on appearances or the word of a single biased party. Major Miller is a man who values his privacy above all else. His military service, his past assignments are highly sensitive. He is not obligated to wear his service on his sleeve, especially not when he is attempting to live a normal life for the sake of his child." Agent Thorne's voice was like a whip. "I'm already in contact with your precinct captain. You can expect a full internal review, officer. And Mr. Harrison, I will personally ensure that not only are you terminated from this position, but that charges are filed against you for making a false report and for the psychological distress you've inflicted on this child." Harrison crumpled, literally sagging against the wall, his bravado utterly evaporated, replaced by a profound and visible terror. His empire of petty grievances had imploded around him. Agent Thorne then turned to Michael, her expression softening once more. "Major Miller, I apologize on behalf of my government for this egregious oversight and the disrespect you and your daughter have been shown. We will ensure all records of this incident are expunged, and that appropriate action is taken against all individuals involved. She then glanced at Lily, who was now quietly sobbing, her face still buried against Michael's leg. Lily, I'm so sorry this happened. Your daddy is a hero, a very brave man. He protects all of us. Lily looked up, her eyes wide and tear-filled, her gaze flickering from Thorn to her father, then back. The simple, honest words of reassurance from a woman of such obvious authority seemed to pierce through her fear. Now, Thorn said, her voice firm again, addressing the room at large, I suggest everyone here cooperates fully with the internal investigations that are about to commence. As for Major Miller and his daughter, they are free to go. No charges, no reports, no further harassment. Is that understood? Her gaze was an absolute command, Brooks no argument. Davies and Jenkins, utterly humiliated and cowed, nodded quickly. The mall security guards, still looking utterly bewildered, also managed to nod. Harrison remained a trembling, pathetic mess. Michael, still holding Lily, met Thorn's eyes. Agent, I appreciate your intervention truly, but all I wanted was to get my daughter a hot dog and a moment of peace. A profound weariness etched itself onto his face, betraying the immense emotional toll this ordeal had taken. Thorn nodded, a look of understanding in her eyes. I know, Major. And you deserve that peace. Go. We'll handle the cleanup. As Michael turned to leave, gently guiding Lily, who now clung to his hand rather than his leg, he paused at the door. He looked back at Mr. Harrison, who was still slumped against the wall, a picture of absolute defeat. Michael felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a hollow emptiness. The man was a casualty of his own prejudice, a small cog in a much larger machine of injustice that Michael had fought against his entire life, albeit in different battlefields. Stepping out of the oppressive atmosphere of the security office and back into the bustling mall, the noise and light seemed overwhelming. Lily looked up at him, her eyes still red-rimmed but slowly losing their terror. Daddy, who was that lady? And you're a major? She whispered, her voice full of awe and confusion. Michael knelt down, pulling her into a tight embrace. The scent of her hair, the soft warmth of her body, was a balm to his soul. She's a very important lady who helped us, sweetie. And yes, I was a major. A long time ago in a different life. But now I'm just your daddy. And we're going to get you that hot dog, okay? He kissed her forehead, then gently wiped the last of her tears away. Lily nodded, a small, tentative smile beginning to form on her lips. Okay, Daddy. And can we still get my bear a little bow tie? Michael chuckled, a genuine sound that had been absent for far too long. Of course, Princess. Anything you want. He stood up, taking her hand, and together they walked towards the food court, leaving the chaos and the shattered reputations behind them. The hot dog, forgotten in the chaos, was cold and unappetizing. But the warmth of Lily's small hand in his, and the quiet dignity of having been truly seen, made it the most satisfying meal he could imagine. The incident was a harsh reminder that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform, and true strength often resides in the quiet, unassuming grace of those who have seen the worst and still choose to do good, even when the world fails to recognize them. They had underestimated a father because they failed to see the legend beneath the ordinary facade, and in doing so, they had brought down an unforeseen storm upon themselves, a storm that would serve as a powerful, humbling lesson in the perils of judging a book by its cover.